It's important to note before we begin that all the UI elements, essentially these panels and buttons, can be accessed and manipulated in code, similar to other game objects. So remember, our main camera is a game object, light. A lot of times when we think about game objects, we think about things like spheres, stuff like this. This is what we think about, like elements that look like 3D or gameplay. Now, the way I was able to zoom in that is I selected it and I hit F like Frank to focus, or maybe F like focus. So let's take a look at the basics of scripts. So in the assets folder, I'm going to right click. Now I have a lot more than you do because I'm using a similar project to code all the games for our project. So I have a lot of stuff in here. So what I generally do is I go to create and I make a folder called junk. Now this junk folder can be used to just place specific items inside of it that you want to delete later or just play around with. So I'm going to create a C# script here, and I'm just going to call this junk. And this is just a junk script. Make sure that when you select it here, the name junk is the same as the class name, otherwise you're going to have errors. So I'm going to go ahead and open this up. Now, something I tend to do at the very beginning of a project is now this might look different because you might have Visual Studio installed and I'm using Writer. You can actually get Writer for free if you're a student. So I would investigate that. But overall, I just prefer Writer over Visual Studio when I'm scripting in Unity. So one of the things I like to do is use something called a namespace. Now, this script here has the word class in it. So you can think of this, and whenever I refer to this chunk of code or this document, really this is just a text document, I'll refer to it as a class. And I tend to use these things called namespaces. And a namespace is a way of organizing or grouping a collection of classes. So when you include a namespace in your class, you're stating that you want to access all the variables and methods, functions in the class under that namespace. So how do we do that? Well, you can easily just start typing the word namespace, and you'll see that it does namespace, and then you can come and give it whatever namespace. I'm just going to name this junk. Now, that's not a specific programming term. And then I can highlight all of this and just drop it between these two curly braces. You could, if you get some weird formatting, like things start to look strange like this, and like maybe this is off center, you can hit Control A to select the entire document, and then hold Control, and then click, while holding Control, hit Control K, and then hit E after that. And what you'll notice is Control F, Control K, and Control F, and that'll reformat or adjust the formatting of your document. Now, what you'll notice up at the top here is there's all these using directives. I want you to think of these as a folder or a library that contains a bunch of code. So for example, if I want to, I'm going to hit Control D here, use the library that gives me access to a bunch of scripts for UI, I do using unityengine.ui. Now, what we can do now is we can actually create things called variables, and variables are just temporary storage places. Now, each variable, and again, you could think of it like a cup that holds something. Each variable type is a class within Unity Engine's UI namespace. So this is a namespace within itself. Therefore, each of these variable types in turn have their own set of variables and functions that can be accessed. So that might be a little bit confusing. So let's take a look at that. If I write let's hold off on public and private for a second. But if I type, for example, button, and then my button, and this is just an arbitrary name I give it, it has this keyword private here. But the reason why this button variable type exists or allows me to use it is because it's contained within the code within this UI folder. And it's a lot to dump on somebody. Really, to be honest with you, if you jump right into coding and you come back to this, you'll see that it's a little bit more comfortable. But this is more of like a definition or a precursor, and I would actually follow along and type as I type. But let's return Unity and see what happens. All right, so in order to use scripts, and if I click off junk and I re-click on it, you can see that it updated. It added that private button, my button here. I'm just going to add this script to my canvas, this junk script. Now you'll see that it has the name of the script and the word junk here. But what I'd like to do is maybe access this button that's below it. Well, in Unity, there's something that's pretty neat, and there's two ways to do this. Is I can open up the variable, which let's jump back into Visual Studio Writer, and I'll show you how to do. Now, what I can do is I can change private to the word public, and I can hit Control S on this to save it. And now when I return to Unity, and I select my canvas, you can see now we have a second option, and it's called My Button, which is the name of the variable that we created. And I can actually grab my button and I can drop it in here. Let's create a couple other elements. So let's say you wanted, I'm going to undrag my button and just drop it on my canvas and delete this panel. Let's say you had a picture that you wanted above your up button. So I'm going to right click on canvas and I'm going to go to UI and I'm going to go to image here. And I'm just going to move it up here above it. And I don't know if I have any really good art. There's like a knob in here. I'll just select whatever. But by selecting the sprite image here, and we're going to make a 2D game later, but this knob or this button here is just a picture that I've applied to that image button. So I'm going to go ahead and save this, and I'm going to go to my scenes folder. You can just throw it in. Actually, let's keep it. Let's just name this scene file junk 2, because we could delete all this stuff out and not have to worry about it. Let's jump back in and see how do we access this button, this image that's underneath our canvas here. Now, just to save time, I'm going to click at the end here and I'm going to hit Control plus D, and that duplicates it. And I'm just going to change button to image. And now what'll happen is I can name this my image, because we're getting a little error there because you can't have two variables in essence with the same name. There are exceptions, but I don't want to overcomplicate it and then scare you off from doing any kind of programming. So here's public button, my button, public image, my image. Let's save this and let's return to Unity and see how we can access or how we do this thing. Now, what I wanted to show you, because you probably figured out like, yeah, of course, I just grab my image and I drop it in there. What I wanted to show you is that if I grab my button and I try to drop it in there, it's only accessing the image part of my button. It's not actually accessing the button itself. So if I grab this image here, it's accessing the whole image of this. Whereas when I made this a button component, it's accessing the entirety of the button. So just so you can see, there's different variable data types that store different stuff. All right, now, by default, when we created this class, we had these two things here called methods. Now, these methods are pre-made scripts, and above each one, there's a comment. Now, the comment here is it says, start is called before the first frame or update. So what I'm going to do here is this is actually called by itself. Like it's called automatically as long as this script is attached to a game object. And we did attach this game object to our canvas. So let's say at the very beginning of our game, we don't want our button or our image to show up. Well, I can actually just type my button, which is the variable name, dot, and then set active. Let's see if we can, maybe it's game object. Yeah, dot set active. And then I'm just going to type the word false here. Now, what's happening here is this is a button, but what I want to do is I want to access the game object component, which is that inspector on the side, and I want to set it to false. I'm going to hit enter again. Let's do my image, dot game object, dot set active. And I also want to set this to false. Now let's hit Control S to save this and return to Unity. All right, so we have our button here. And this inspector, this is essentially a game object. And this is what I mean by set active. So by setting it to false at start, it should turn this off. So I want you to watch this as I press play. Notice that both of these, my image and my button at the very start, are no longer active. So at the very beginning of our game. So what we can do later is we can go in here and we can say, okay, when the button is clicked or another button is clicked, we can set these to true. And that's where this event system comes into play. So you can see there's this standalone input mode, and it has these different things: horizontal, vertical, submit button, cancel. Don't worry too much about these options. We're going to get into it in a second. But this event system essentially controls what element. So for example, like if we want the first item that's selected in our UI to be the button, we can drag that in there. And so this really controls the event system, which is the things that happen. So an event can be something like when I click the button, things will listen for that. And we're going to be doing a lot of event-driven coding. Now, I'm just going to give you a brief overview of this, but the event system has essentially, by default, three components: the transform event, the event system manager, and a standalone input mode. Now, since the event system is a game object, just like a sphere or anything else, it physically exists within the scene, even though it has not renderable components, which making it visible inside of here. So this is it living inside the scene. Now, the event system manager is the component that actually does all the tracking and managing of the various system elements. Whereas the standalone input mode is which controls things like the keyboard presses and all the other stuff. But it's important to notice that send navigation events is checked on here, and can be toggled on and off. When this property is enabled, like here, you can navigate between UI elements like a gamepad, joystick, or keyboard. All right, before I end this video, I just want to do one last thing, and I want to show you how we can script the button being pressed, and then we could take a look at this on-click thing in another video. All right, so here we are back in our code editor. I'm going to just go in here and just delete both of these out. And what I can do in update is I'm going to use something called an if statement. So I'm going to type if and then hit tab twice. And what this does is it just creates the structure. So what an if statement is it has the word if, an open close parenthesis, and then an open curly brace and a close one. Now this update function is called every frame by itself. So if your computer is doing 60 frames a second, it's called 60 times a second. This isn't the most performant thing to use, but it's often useful. Now, if we want to access input, which is anything like a keyboard, mouse, button, we use this word input here. So what I can do inside of if is I can say input dot get button, and I'm going to do down here. And what we can do is it says input.get button down, and which button do we want to get? So let's start with the word submit here. Now, inside of Unity, the word submit is mapped to the enter key on your keyboard. So let's go ahead and do a print statement, and I'll show you where we read those. And then we could just type enter key is pressed. And then I'm going to go ahead and hit Control S to save this. Now this is different from the button, and we'll get into that maybe in the next video. So let's return to Unity and see what happens when we press the enter key. Now make sure that you save that script. But we're going to go to Window, and we're going to go to General, and then we're going to expand Console or hit Control-Shift-C. Now I'm going to press play, and I'm going to press the enter key. And if you don't see anything, you have to turn on this option here. But every time I press the enter key, and I'm clicking in my menu here, you can see that it's saying the enter key is being pressed. So that's an easy way of getting input. Now, if you go to File and then, Edit and then Project Settings, Input Manager here, you can see here that there's two options here for Submit. And the positive button is the return or enter key. So this is the way that they map all of the keys inside of Unity. All right, so that's it for this video. And we're going to continue to just kind of build on the basics of these concepts before we jump into our other games.